Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar. My name's Peter Baddeley. We're going to be talking about organizational charts in a few different ways. So organizational charts, departmental charts, and searchable directories as well. I'll start with a few slides just to explain a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, the demos we're going to cover, and then we'll dive into some demos. One of the great things about all of the QuizCom products is they're very easy to use. I'm not a deeply technical person, and I find them really easy to work with. And I'll also be able to show you live on screen how easy they are to work with and how configurable they are, rather than just telling you they are, which is the great thing about them. So I guess the first thing to point out is that the org chart actually is part of a suite of products within the DataView Plus toolset. Each of these can either be purchased individually or they can be purchased as a whole. And it's a set of SPFX web parts, which are all to do with different data retrieval scenarios. So organizational data, list data, aggregation, pictures, calendars, even charts. And over the next few slides, I'm just showing the fact that we can display information in different ways, whether that's users, documents, calendar items, displaying them on mobile devices, and even things like pictures. And we can work with a range of data sources, including SharePoint data sources and the Graph API. We can also display and render information using custom controls using the DataView Plus. But today we're going to focus on the org chart, and that's all about delivering real-time, interactive, easy to use, and very customizable organizational charts connecting to a wide range of data sources. Now, those data sources include SharePoint lists, Excel spreadsheets. So from those scenarios where maybe your Active Directory is not your best source of data. If it is, then we can connect to your AD using the Graph API, or we can connect to your SharePoint user profile. We can also connect to multiple data sources if you need to combine different data sources together. We can look at different layouts and themes to present our org chart in different ways. We can manage things like multiple managers, assistants, and even putting in placeholders for when you've got a vacancy. We've also got a lot of ways to customize, configure these organization charts with filters, conditional formatting, and export options. And of course, finally, it's available within Microsoft Teams as well as in SharePoint. So I've got 3 key demos I'm going to show you today. The first is going to talk about the basics. So this is just going to show you the basics of configuring an organization chart, applying things like conditional formatting, layouts. I'm going to show you and talk you through the basics of adding a web part, configuring that data source. Also, this concept of a Lego style builder interface to add different controls such as conditional formatting, filtering, etc. As well as showing some more of the advanced functionality like assistants and multiple managers. Next, I'll be able to move on to perhaps what you could describe a company org chart or a corporate organizational chart. And I'm going to show you how you can present this data in different ways. So in a more traditional org chart format, or also in a searchable directory interface as well. So in this demo, we'll be looking at things like custom filters, different layouts and tables, what we call display groups, so we can have different sets of data presented in different ways. And we'll also look at tab controls. Finally, I'll look at other scenarios, such as personal organizational charts, so things based on me, or departmental, so actually presenting, maybe on a department divisions page on SharePoint or team, that we can present an organizational chart specific to them. So this specific demo will include things like hidden filters, putting placeholders in for vacancies, and also looking at those personal charts. Okay. So I've switched screens now, and I'm in a browser session. So I'm in SharePoint. Hopefully this should be fairly familiar to you. Let's just zoom that in so everyone can see that okay. And we'll start with our first demo today. Now, what I like to do in all of my demos is show you what I've created, and then we'll have a look at how we go about and configure it. So here's my organizational chart configured on my page, and let's just show you some of the features of that. So firstly, it's worth bearing in mind that these different sections of my organizational chart are very easily expandable and collapsible with zooming type features. You notice I've got a hierarchy here. So I've got different employees who report to Peter, for example, and then some which where Roy is their manager. I've also got other functionalities here, like showing David in a different format. That's because he's one of the assistants. I've also got an orange line that shows one of my users has multiple managers, and we'll have a little look about how you can configure that. And I've got some conditional formatting going on. So I've got Peter covered in black, and I've got these two users, or these group of users highlighted in green. And we'll have a look at how we configure all of those. Other things, if we click on a specific person in our organizational chart, we get a little card pop out so we can see more information about them. Interact with different things, video calling, email, and even pop out a full profile, which we can control what fields are displayed there as well. So that's that actually using the organizational chart. Let's have a little look at how we can configure it. So firstly, I want to talk about my data source. So to start with today, I'm going to look at using a SharePoint list. This is actually commonly used as a data source for when organizations are building out org charts. Maybe their Active Directory is not fully up to date. I've worked with a customer recently where their organizational chart is managed in a HR system. So we have a process to export that data and then manage it in a SharePoint list. Maybe we have no system or data source at all, and a SharePoint list is a great place to manage those employees. You can see here I've got a number of columns such as employee name, position, department. Notice I've got both a manager and a reports to. So Jane has a manager, but she also reports to Peter, as well as email address and telephone number. So that's my data source. Now let's look at how we can start to configure things. So let's edit my page. Now firstly, I'm just going to remove this web part, and we'll add it completely afresh just so I can show you how simple it is to configure this web part and define all of the settings. So I've already installed the app into my Office 365 tenant, but I'll touch on at the end of the presentation today how easily that is done. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add my organizational chart. And the first thing it asks me to do is configure my data source. So this pops up a simple window and it's going to say add a data source. I'm going to give it a name. And I'm going to choose from a range of data source types. So Excel, Graph API, SharePoint user profiles, or in this case, a SharePoint list. We'll talk more about these settings as we go through some of the other demo scenarios. You then are presented with some options to define this data source. So we can connect to a SharePoint URL. Note how it's not dependent on being in that site. It can be a different site within my tenant. I can also select a SharePoint list. So let's select my employees list. And notice there are options to use a specific view. So if I want to, maybe I've only got active or current employees and I only want to show them in my chart, I can easily do that. I can then define most of my column mappings. Now actually it's picked up most of these. It's a fairly smart and easy to use tool, but if it hadn't, I could then select the relevant column to map in here. I'm going to close that, and we can see here that my org chart's been pretty much immediately configured. And by default, this is using what's called simple mode. So it's just defined, set up, and it's designed maybe for your site, an end user managing a specific site who doesn't want to get into advanced customization or any additional configuration, and they just want to deploy something very, very quickly. In less than a minute or two, I can get this up and running. But I do have some options available here. So for example, I can go in and change my orientation. So if I want it to be right to left, for example, I can do that. I also do have a number of styles available to me. So maybe I want to choose the dark style or pencil. So I have a range of templates available to me. I'm going to choose the rectangle, I think. Yeah, that looks great. Notice also I can define the column values which are displayed, so the name and also what's displayed under there. So if I wanted to display a different field other than position, I could easily do that. And there we go. My org chart is configured, ready to use straight away. And I can come in and start exploring that. And note how it's built that connection to Jane straight away. Her manager is Roy, but she reports to Peter. So very easy to do. But there's a lot more capability available in the app, and we can do that by switching to advanced mode. And this sort of activates the web part, gives me a lot more settings. So first of all, the core org chart has a number of other settings. There are actually several different org chart controls. So if I want to switch between them, I can do. Each of them has their own style and features available to them. Also, for each of those specific controls, there'll be far more settings available to me now. So I can say the number of levels. Maybe I only want one level open by default. Yeah, maybe I want a couple. I can define the height that web part will take up on my page, orientation, layout, of course those templates. I can define something for an assistant. That will come to that in a second, and you'll see how that works shortly. We'll leave that as it is. And I can also define various zoom and search controls, turning them on. Maybe I'll keep my export options. Do I want the employee count? I don't think so, so I'm going to turn that option off in this case. So just more things. I can also define additional what actions I have. So you remember when I opened the profile, I could define, I could see things like open them on LinkedIn and Facebook and stuff like that. If I've got my own one, I can come in here and I can define that. Now, if you're someone who's maybe got some development skills, you can define a specific piece of JavaScript code, but also Quizcom make a number of options available to you by default. So maybe you had things like a location, you could have a map option, call their phone, whatever it might be. There's several different options available here. I don't actually want to do that this time, but just so you understand that those options are there. So that's some controls and settings around the org chart itself. But we then also have the opportunity to define these additional controls to add. This is where we get this sort of Lego type building interface. We can build up those controls. And we see I've got a range of ones here. Filter we've got already got on, and I'll have a look at that in more in the next demo, as well as things like groups and tabs. I'm going to have a look now at conditional formatting. So I add that in. It adds in a specific control. And then I can start to define some options around it. So say, for instance, I wanted to color code a specific part of my org chart. So maybe anyone who's part of Roy's department, which is operations. So I can do that really simply. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add a conditional formatting rule. I'm going to say it's called operations. What's it going to do? It's going to apply a color. So maybe it's going to set a background color of red, for example. Yeah. Now immediately that's selected everyone, and that's because we haven't defined the actual condition. So I can come in here and I'm going to go department is equal to, picks up my choice values, operations. You'll now notice relevant people are formatted. Other things like hiding is available here. Other options I've got is I can define someone to be an assistant. Yeah. And I enable it. So an assistant's a specific piece of formatting. And then I need to define my condition. Well, I actually had an assistant field in my SharePoint list, so I can easily do that. And if we come down here now, do you recall that when we defined the settings a moment ago, we could define an assistant layout? So you see that David has a specific layout associated with him. Let's just republish that so we can see what that looks like. And those conditional formats are available here, so we can remove some of them if we want to. Yeah. Also, that hide option you saw was very useful because we can do things like hide specific people. Maybe there's someone who reports to the CEO, but actually you don't want them displayed in the org chart for whatever reason. You can easily do that. I also define those export options. So in this case, I've enabled them so I can export my chart to a variety of formats. Often what people want to be able to export that for printing or saving, whatever it might be. Other things which I can do. I can also configure specific formats against specific users. So as well as doing my conditional formatting, I can also come in and say, well, actually, I'd like to apply a specific piece of formatting, in this case to Peter. So let's just edit the org chart again. And we'll see here when we select Peter in these little drop down, I get the little edit control only when I'm in the edit mode. And I can either choose to hide someone specifically, so that manual edit, or I can say, well, actually, I'd like Peter to be a stripe label, for example. And we can see then there's a different format for him. So lots of ability to very quickly customize and format my org chart. Okay, so that takes us through that first demo. Now let's look at building that out and having a look at connecting to the Graph API. Now I've called this example like a directory. So I see this as sort of like an organizational directory connecting maybe to the graph, could also connect to a SharePoint list. And I've got here my org chart. Now you see what I've done here is I've got a tabbed interface. So I can easily tab through and see different departments. Yeah. And the org chart based on the principles in that department. I can also easily filter, so I could filter to look at a specific department or to look at a specific location. So I've added the filter control. And I've got additional tabs up here, or what's called display groups, where I can either display a completely different data source or the same data source but formatted in a very different way. So here we've got it more in a traditional directory interface where I can do a general search, or I can say, well, actually, I'm interested in seeing everyone in a specific department. And I can even go in and do certain actions like email, or even go and have a look at their profile and quickly get information on them. So very quick and easy to build something which presents data in lots of different ways. And of course, there are many ways to format this. This is just showing you some examples. So same format as before. Let's go and show you how to do this. Now, in this case, I'm not going to go and show you a data source because I'm connecting to my Graph API and my Azure Active Directory profile information. But again, don't worry, you don't need to know about how to use the Graph API because Quizcom have made it nice and easy for you. So I'm going to go and add my org chart web part again, and I'm going to configure the data source. In this case, I'm going to call it Graph API, and I'm going to choose a data source type. So I'm going to choose Graph API. Now this looks complicated, it looks like I need to understand a path. Again, don't worry. Quizcom have presented and provided you with some standard options, including connecting to user profile information and my contacts. But in this case, we want to connect to the Graph API or user information. Now, there's lots of ability here if you've got things like extended properties or filters you need to put in place to customize this connection. We won't dwell on that too much today. You can also define what columns are configured and that mapping again as well. If I exit that, I can see there's my org chart configured. I won't go into any more detail around different styling because we've already sort of covered that. But what I will look at is these controls in a bit more detail. So firstly, we've got the filter control. That's already here. It comes with a standard search box, which will let you just search all fields. There's also a search box as part of the core org chart control. We can easily turn that off, so I don't want that. That's gone. I can then choose to add additional fields which I want to be able to filter on. So maybe I want to filter on department and office location. And maybe I don't want the general search option, so I'll turn off the free text filter. What does that let me do? It let me search in either of these fields, so I can do a free text search in these fields, or it will also provide me with the ability to select the options which are available. Tab controls are equally very easy to configure. So again, switching to my advanced mode, I'm going to add the tab control. And all I need to do is define what is my group by. So is it department, is it location, whatever attribute you want it to be. And it automatically builds that out for me. So that tab control is immediately there. Cool. But what if I want to add that directory as well? Now, of course, I can change the layout of this one, but I actually want both on my screen. So we do that using display groups. If I go back and configure the data source, I've got the option to create a display group. So I'm going to create the first one and call it org chart. Yeah. Define what data source is included. So if we had different data sources, we could split them across display groups. And we can define who has access to that. So we might want to limit who sees what. And then I'm going to add another group and I'm going to call it directory. Yeah. I'm going to add the same data source. So I've now got two display groups, my org chart and my directory. Well, I need to customize this one because I don't want those same settings. That's really easy to do. Switch to advanced mode. Firstly, I'm not going to have tabs in this interface, so we'll get rid of tabs in the directory display group. I'm going to leave my filter controls, but then I'm just going to change what the control I'm using here. So instead of using an org chart, I'm going to use the table. There we go, brilliant. I've got a directory style listing. I'm not 100% happy with those columns, so I'm going to go in and configure the control. I'm going to go and start defining the columns I want. So I want name. I'd like email address. Maybe I want position. And let's add in department. I can do that. And I've got that ability to configure item actions as well. So specific things you do in the context of each of those records. And there we go. There's my org chart with the various controls I defined. And then if I switch here, here's my directory. And I've got the ability to search and look at people in a specific location, for example. Yeah, very, very quick and easy to connect to graph information, my information in Azure Active Directory, and also build out 2 different display groups presenting that data in different ways. Okay, the final demo today is having a look at a specific department. So how do we use the org chart to filter down by a specific department? Again, let's show you the example. So I've got the operations department here. A few things to notice. Again, slightly different layout. I've got an assistant defined again. We've talked about that before. And I'm also showing this vacancy. So that's not a person. It's just the fact that we have a vacancy available. So let's show you how to do that. Now, in this case, I just wanted to point out that I have got a separate SharePoint list here. My core data source is going to be the Graph API again, but I've defined any vacancies in this list, the title, and also who is that manager of that vacancy is. Let's edit the page and configure this again. So let's delete the web part and just re-add the org chart. I like to show you from the start. There we go. And then again, go in and add my data source. So we'll call this Graph API. Connect to the Graph API. I'll go through this very quickly because I've already sort of covered this before. And then I'm going to add another data source and I'm going to call this vacancies. Yeah, I'm going to connect to SharePoint list. And then I'm going to choose my vacancies list. A few things to note. There's only a couple of columns mapped here, the name, the position, and the manager. I don't need these other columns because it's not a real person, it's just a vacancy. And I want to color code this data source so it's slightly differently presented in my org chart. So we know it's a vacancy. So let's pick a lovely yellow for it. I'm going to close that. And then let's immediately switch to advanced mode and start to do some configuration. So we'll just maybe change a couple of settings. We'll get rid of the zoom and the search controls. And we'll also change the layout so it is, let's actually do the orientation instead. Let's go left to right to get that presented the way we want. And then let's choose a template of round label, let's say. Perfect. And then finally, I want to filter this. So I'm going to add a filter and I'm going to say the department is equal to operations. And I'm going to hide this control so it's not available to users. And what I forgot to do was save it. So it's saved for everyone. That setting is saved for everyone. But what I did was I hid it. So it's a sort of default filter. Users can't change it. And I could add another filter control to let people do further filtering. Let's publish that. There's my org chart. And if, for instance, I expand under Jane, oh, it's a little bit hard to read, but hopefully you'll see the HR vacancy is displayed there. So we know we've got a vacancy in that space. And if I didn't want that displayed, I could quickly turn that off, and then that's not going to be visible at all. So we've got some options to configure departmental, location-specific org charts, adding them to SharePoint pages. I could add these to Teams, and I can also put in things like employee placeholders. Now, there are, of course, a number of other data sources available, such as using the SharePoint user profile service. So if I wanted to present just myself and who reported to me, I could also do that. I am conscious of time today, so let me go back to my slideshow and just talk briefly about the installation process, and then we can answer any questions. So the configuration. It's really super easy to add to your tenant. You'll need to be the global admin, first of all, just to complete this step, but you go to the QuizCon website and you select the specific app. There's actually a wizard where you'll then put in your SharePoint URL and it will walk you through the process of connecting it and deploying the app to your tenant. Once deployed, you'll also be able to sync it to Microsoft Teams. And I'm sure you're all familiar with how to add an app inside of Microsoft Teams. The configuration process is very similar to many other apps. And once you're inside of the app, it's exactly the same as what I've shown you in SharePoint. But we can then present a similar org chart, departmental specific maybe, inside of Teams with all of those same layout, filters, and other controls, conditional formattings, which I've talked about. So to summarize, I guess a few key points from me. It's easy to connect with a variety of different data sources with the org chart. We can leverage the power of the Graph API. Now, I've only really shown you one example with the Graph API. The Graph, if anyone who knows and familiar with it, of course you're aware there's lots of options with the Graph. It's very easy to customize. There was nothing technical there. It's that sort of building Lego blocks together with those different controls. It's important to mention that I've been showing you Office 365 today. This does also work with SharePoint 2019. We can, of course, add the app to Microsoft Teams. And whilst you can buy the org chart on its own, it's also available as that sort of wider tool set called DataView Plus, where you've got lots of other different data sources to connect to and a wider range of ways of displaying that data as well. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to hand back to Sarah for some questions.